On the afternoon of January 26, 1996, a black Lincoln Continental rolled slowly up a private gravel driveway in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, and stopped a few feet from a small stone cottage. Inside the car sat a 57-year-old man worth roughly $200 million, heir to one of the largest chemical fortunes in American history, dressed that day in a bathrobe and slippers despite the winter cold. He rolled down his window. An Olympic gold medalist named Dave Schultz was standing in his own driveway, getting into his own car, in the middle of an ordinary Friday afternoon on an estate this same rich man had built specifically to house and train him. The rich man raised a pistol and shot Schultz 3 times, once in the arm as he tried to shield himself, once in the back as he turned, and once directly into his chest at point-blank range as he lay on the frozen ground, while Schultz's wife watched from inside their home and heard her husband's last words, spoken to the man who had just killed him, asking him what was wrong. What had he done? Then John Eleuthère du Pont rolled his window back up, drove roughly 30 yards to his own mansion, walked inside, and locked the door behind him. It would take Pennsylvania State Police 2 full days, a cut water line, a disabled heating and electrical system, repeated failed negotiation attempts broadcast live on national television, and a tactical team finally storming the building through a garage door before they got him out, discovered wandering his own basement in the cold. This is not a story about a fortune that got lost. The DuPont money never went anywhere. It is a story about what happens when a family successfully protects its wealth for 200 years and still cannot protect the person standing at the very end of that bloodline. To understand how the heir to one of the safest, most carefully structured fortunes in American history ended up shooting a man in a driveway, you have to understand that the DuPonts did almost everything right by the rules this channel usually measures families against. Eleuthère Irénée du Pont, a French chemist fleeing the aftermath of the French Revolution, arrived in America in 1800 and built a gunpowder mill on the banks of Delaware's Brandywine River 2 years later. Gunpowder was brutal, dangerous, and essential, and the DuPont family ran the mills with an engineer's discipline for generation after generation, expanding from explosives into chemicals, plastics, synthetic fibers, and eventually one of the largest industrial conglomerates on Earth. Unlike almost every family in this channel's back catalog, the DuPonts never let the business dissolve into a single heir's hands or scatter through an ugly public feud. They incorporated. They built a holding structure. They kept ownership spread deliberately across dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of family members, all of it anchored to one functioning company that kept manufacturing and kept paying dividends regardless of which individual DuPont was thriving or falling apart in any given year. By the 20th century, the DuPont name did not describe one man's fortune. It described an entire clan numbering in the thousands, all drawing income from the same industrial machine. This is the boring, correct answer to almost every disaster on this channel. The DuPonts built it, and it worked exactly as designed, and none of it was enough to save John DuPont from himself, because the machine that protects a fortune was never built to protect a mind. John Eleuthère du Pont was born in 1938 into the wealthiest, most insulated corner of that clan on a 900-acre estate outside Philadelphia called Leicester Hall, later renamed Foxcatcher Farm. His parents divorced when he was 2 years old, and his father, a naval officer, largely disappeared from his life afterward, remarrying and starting a new family with little contact left over for the son he had left behind. John was raised almost entirely by his mother, Jean Eleuthère du Pont, a formidable, controlling woman who ran the estate like a private kingdom of stables, formal gardens, and staff, and kept her son close, sheltered, and almost entirely without ordinary childhood friends his own age. He grew up alone on hundreds of acres of manicured grounds, tutored privately rather than sent to school with other children, surrounded by servants rather than peers, a boy with effectively unlimited money and almost no genuine human contact to spend it on. His closest companions for long stretches reportedly the household staff and the animals on the estate, rather than anyone his own age. He became obsessive in the specific way that isolated, unchallenged wealth often produces obsession. First, it was stamps and seashells, collections assembled with academic intensity and cataloged with an almost military precision. Then, it became ornithology, and by his 20s, he had funded genuine scientific expeditions to remote corners of the globe, published real academic papers on birds, and built one of the largest private natural history collections in the world, all before he turned 30. He was, by every account, a genuinely intelligent, capable man, fully capable of doing real things with his fortune. The problem was never a lack of ability. The problem was that nothing he did ever seemed to satisfy the one person whose approval he was actually chasing. His mother, by most accounts, considered wrestling a low, undignified sport, something beneath the family name and closer to a barroom brawl than the equestrian pursuits she favored on her own side of the estate. John Dupont became consumed by wrestling specifically because of that disapproval, the way a starved man becomes consumed by the one food placed just out of reach. After his mother died in 1988, leaving him one of the largest personal shares of the Dupont wealth, along with sole, unchallenged control of the estate for the first time in his life, he stopped merely watching wrestling from a distance and began buying his way directly into the sport at its highest level. He built a sprawling athletic complex on the Foxcatcher estate, including one of the finest wrestling training facilities in the world, complete with regulation mats, weight rooms, and dormitory-style housing, and he began recruiting the actual best wrestlers in the United States to live, train, and compete under his personal sponsorship. He called the program Team Foxcatcher. He funded it lavishly, paying salaries, covering Olympic training expenses that USA Wrestling itself could never have matched, buying equipment, arranging international competitions, and positioning himself as the sport's single most important private benefactor almost overnight, eventually even having himself listed as an assistant coach on official rosters despite limited wrestling credentials of his own. Among the athletes he recruited was Dave Schultz, a 1984 Olympic gold medalist and one of the most respected wrestlers and coaches in the country, who moved his entire family onto the estate to train under DuPont's sponsorship, along with his brother Mark Schultz, another Olympic gold medalist. For a few years, it looked from the outside like an eccentric billionaire's generous, if strange, gift to American amateur sports. Underneath the funding and the medals, DuPont's mind was coming apart in ways the wrestlers living on his own property watched happen in real time. He began telling people he was the Dalai Lama, or that he had supernatural gifts, or that people, sometimes including his own athletes, were plotting to kill him. He had trees on the property cut down because he believed enemies were hiding behind them, watching the main house through the branches. He had furniture inexplicably rearranged in the dead of night, convinced hidden threats were tracking his movements through the rooms by the patterns of the chairs and tables. He carried firearms constantly and openly on an estate already stocked with an extensive personal armory, including armored vehicles he had purchased for reasons no one around him could ever fully explain. He drank heavily, and his sleep grew erratic, athletes recalling him wandering the training facility at 3 and 4 in the morning, agitated and rambling. Athletes who lived and trained there later described a man swinging unpredictably between generous benefactor and erratic, threatening presence. Someone with the money to make anyone around him deeply uncomfortable disappear from the program entirely, and the paranoia to eventually turn that same instability toward the very people he had paid to bring close to him. By the mid-1990s, people who knew him well, coaches, staff, even his own household employees, were describing a man in obvious accelerating psychiatric crisis, and almost nobody with the power to intervene meaningfully did, because the man in crisis also happened to be the person signing every check, the landlord of the very cottages his athletes lived in, and the sole source of a wrestling program that had become, for many of them, their entire livelihood. On that January afternoon in 1996, DuPont drove to Dave Schultz's cottage on the estate for reasons that were never fully coherently explained, not by DuPont himself and not by anyone who studied the case afterward. There was no public argument beforehand, no clear final trigger anyone could point to. He simply arrived, rolled down the window, and shot a man who had spent years living on his property, training under his money, treating him, by every account, with genuine warmth and patience, even as his behavior grew stranger. Nancy Schultz, Dave's wife, ran outside after the shots and watched her husband die in the driveway, cradling him as police and paramedics raced toward the estate. DuPont retreated to his mansion and barricaded himself inside for 2 days, during which police negotiators tried repeatedly to talk him out over the phone, cutting his utilities one by one in an effort to force the issue. Snipers positioned around the grounds, news helicopters circling overhead, broadcasting the standoff live to a stunned national audience who had never heard the name DuPont attached to anything but chemistry and old money. He was finally taken into custody on January 28th when officers used the pretext of fixing his broken boiler to get an entry point, catching him wandering, disoriented and half frozen, near the garage where he had first driven back after the shooting. The trial that followed spent months untangling the exact same question that runs through every story on this channel, just aimed at a mind instead of a balance sheet. Was John DuPont a calculating killer, or a man whose fortune had let his psychiatric decline go completely unchecked for years past the point where anyone with less money and more oversight would have been hospitalized long before he ever got near a gun? Defense psychiatrists testified to years of documented paranoid delusions. Prosecutors countered that he had understood exactly what he was doing, pointing to his flight back to the house and the days-long standoff as evidence of a man aware enough to try to escape consequences. In 1997, a jury found him guilty but mentally ill of third-degree murder, a verdict that tried to hold both truths at once: that he had committed the killing and that his mind was genuinely diseased when he did it. He was sentenced to 13 to 30 years in prison. He never expressed the kind of remorse prosecutors or the Schultz family were looking for, largely because, by most accounts, his illness never fully allowed him to process what he had actually done. He died in prison in December of 2010 of natural causes, having served roughly 13 years of his sentence. Never released, the wrestling program he had founded permanently shuttered, his name forever attached to a killing rather than to the ornithology papers or Olympic sponsorships that had once defined his public life. Here is the part that separates this story from every other collapse on this channel, and it is worth sitting with directly. The DuPont fortune itself did not crack. The holding company kept operating. The broader clan, thousands of descendants spread across dozens of branches, kept receiving their dividends and living their ordinary, comfortable, protected lives entirely undisturbed by what one deeply troubled cousin had done in a Pennsylvania driveway. Every structural lesson this channel usually points to, spread ownership, professional management, a machine bigger than any single heir, worked exactly the way it was designed to work. Nobody's inheritance evaporated. No court seized the family's industrial holdings. The corporate entity that had survived 2 world wars and a century of American history did not even notice John DuPont's murder trial as a balance sheet event. And that is precisely the point this story exists to make. A well-built financial structure can protect money from bad decisions, family feuds, and reckless spending with remarkable reliability. It was never designed to, and it cannot, protect a person from isolation, from a mother's impossible standard, from decades of unchecked psychiatric decline inside a mansion nobody with real authority was ever allowed to walk into and simply say no. Look at the other families in this channel's catalog, and the contrast becomes sharp. The Hiltons lost their claim to the company on purpose, aimed by their own founders' convictions. The Astors lost 2 disasters 90 years apart because nobody ever built a protective structure at all. The fortune left exposed on a sinking ship, and then again inside an old woman's own unguarded house. Barbara Hutton was handed a fortune with no machine attached to it and no one who ever taught her the difference between wealth and income. The DuPonts are the exception that proves how far structure alone can carry a family and exactly where its protection runs out. The company survived. The dividends kept flowing. Every mechanism this channel usually blames for a family's collapse simply was not present here. And a man still ended up shooting an Olympic champion in a gravel driveway because nobody in 200 years of careful financial engineering ever built a system capable of noticing that the person at the center of it all was drowning in plain sight. There is a specific kind of American myth wrapped up in stories like this one. The idea that enough money eventually buys its way out of every kind of trouble, including the trouble a person carries inside their own head. John DuPont had more resources available to him than almost anyone in American history, a fortune built by chemists and engineers who understood risk and containment better than almost anyone on Earth, an entire family machine engineered across 7 generations specifically to prevent catastrophic loss. None of it bought him a childhood with real friends in it. None of it bought him a mother who approved of the sport he chased her love through. None of it, in the end, bought Dave Schultz his life back or gave John DuPont 14 years in a Pennsylvania prison cell instead of the freedom his money had purchased for every other member of his family for 2 centuries. The fortune did exactly what it was built to do. It kept standing. The man standing at the end of it did not, and no holding company on Earth was ever built to catch that kind of fall.